Well, good evening. I'm Alan Jackson. Welcome back to Nashville. We're glad to have you join us again. With so many outlets for news, we're doing something that's very different here, something that's far more useful than a constant flow of short, supposedly breaking news stories. We call that motion and pace over meaning or purpose. Well, our goal is different. If you're going to spend 30 minutes with us, we want you to hear information with depth and understanding from the experts who've seen it from the inside. And all of it anchored in the truth and the hope that comes with knowing the truth. That's a biblical worldview. So with that, I want to get to the big issue tonight, America's place in the world. How we keep the peace and what does it take to do that? To do so, the United States needs not just the leadership, but the military equipment so that no other country will challenge our standing. We can't afford to have a World War III, but I'm not so sure that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the global terrorist network agrees. Right now, they respect our strength, even if they don't admit it publicly, but they also continue to show signs of wanting to challenge it. No one knows that better than Captain Chuck Nash. He's a distinguished naval officer of 25 years, a career with 4,300 flight hours, and get this, 965 successful landings on aircraft carriers. Welcome back, Chuck.
Nice to be back with you, Pastor.
Well, let's start with the war in Ukraine. You've been making the point for years that eventually Russia's advantage in manpower would give them the advantage no matter what help we sent to Ukraine. Is that why we're now at the point where President Trump has been able to put together a deal for peace? Zelensky is coming to the U.S. to sign the deal. It took more than one day, as candidate Trump set out to do, but peace in 1 month still seems pretty good, isn't it?
It's absolutely astounding, but it was destined to come to this. If you look at just the demographics, as you pointed out in your laydown, Russia has more military-aged males than the Ukraine had males, period. And that's before a significant percentage of the population fled when the war started. So Russia could just overpower and wait out and grind away. And that's what the Russians do. It's in their DNA to suffer, and they're willing to take the casualties to win. And they've proven that time and again. Look at Stalingrad, look at World War II. They just will endure. So Ukraine was going to have to give up land. They're lucky they didn't get conquered in toto, but that was just because of the corruption and the ineptitude of the Russian leadership when this thing kicked off.
Well, I've heard voices expressing concern that Putin is getting more than he should have, especially given that he started the invasion. President Trump believes that both sides have lost far too many lives and something had to be done to stop the bloodshed. Listen to how he sees it.
My function is to get you out of the war, get them out of the war, let them live. It's a bloody war, it's a horrible war. Thousands of people are being killed a week. And I would say Russia, maybe 700,000 people. I think Ukraine probably a similar number, and that's not talking about the towns and the cities that have been blown up. That's talking about soldiers. This has been a horrible, bloody mess, and we're going to get it solved.
It's hard to disagree with any of that, but do you think that President Trump has sided more with the Russians than Ukraine?
No, I think he's trying to go right down the middle, and by that I mean it's going to extract a toll from Ukraine. They're going to have to give up the Crimea once and for all. They're going to have to give up most of the land that the Russians have conquered in the Donbass region, because that is the one thing that Putin wanted more than anything, which is that land bridge to the Crimea. People keep talking about it because it is vitally important to Russia. Now, what is going to also be extracted is this rare earth mineral deal. Why that is strategically important for Ukraine. They're not just giving up access and therefore wealth to the United States to pay back the $300 billion or so that we've invested in Ukraine, but by having U.S. interests in the northeastern part of Ukraine, that's where those mines are, which is right up against where the Russians have taken that Donbass land. So what that does is it places U.S. interests right against the new Russian conquered territory, and thus provides a barrier. So it's not just about the money. There's a strategic goal involved in this.
Going back to the fighting, were Mr. Zelensky's troops able to be effectively trained to use the advanced weapons that we gave them?
I think for some of them, yes, but old habits die hard, and they used a lot of rather exquisite weapons in a manner that would befit more Soviet type tactics, Russian tactics. But I don't hold that against them, Pastor, because when you consider that the United States is a maneuver warfare, combined arms style of fighting, and they were involved in what was more akin to World War I trench fighting. Mm-hmm. So they were there doing the best they could to survive under some horrific conditions, undermanned, arms getting them to them late, and the Russians just pouring bodies into the fight. So they had their work cut out for them, and it's amazing that they have survived as long as they have.
Do you think that what we've watched in Ukraine will continue to work going forward with U.S. manpower staying out of harm's way, but U.S. advanced weapons being shared with our friends?
Well, that's what we have to do. We have to ensure that this remains a stalemate for the negotiations to take place. If it looked like we were going to fold on the Ukrainians, the Russians would not sign the deal. But by backing the Ukrainians to a stalemate and the strategic move of the interest in the mines in the Northeast, that will turn the deal, and the Russians will be happy to stop the bloodshed. The Ukrainians have wiped out a generation. The Russians have wiped out a significant part of their generation, and neither country can afford that demographically. They just can't, especially the Russians.
You know, I've heard multiple voices complaining about the possible end of the war. I don't understand, what's the motivation for wanting to continue the fighting?
I don't get it. I mean, I really don't get it. If you're at least maybe looking at some kind of financial gain from this or power, but it makes no sense at all, because it is just grinding up men. It's just grinding them up. And the civilian body count is horrific. So to continue this a day further than it has to be is just a crime against humanity.
Well, let's take a short break now. It's time for you to jump in with your thoughts with an email that you can send to comments@alanjacksonnow.com. We'd love to hear what you have to say about Ukraine, Russia, and what's next. I'll be right back. We're back now with Captain Chuck Nash, and we're talking about America's role in the world. President Trump is working hard to bring a lasting peace to not just Ukraine, but to Israel as well, to do so as effectively as possible. Iran has to be stopped. Now, that will likely include what was just put out in a new report from the United Nations, that Iran now has enough enriched uranium for 6 nuclear weapons, double the amount it had just 15 weeks ago. The president's national security advisor has made clear that this is unacceptable to President Trump. Listen to what he had to say.
Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. That not only would be existential for Israel, I think it would be existential for the entire world, because it could kick off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. President Trump is absolutely serious, deadly serious, when he says Iran can never have a nuke, and certainly not on President Trump's watch.
Do you think Iran is trying to do this to negotiate some sort of deal with Trump, or do they realize that their leadership will no longer exist if they continue down this nuclear path they're on?
Well, the last time we talked, Pastor, I said it could go either way. One, because they had lost Hezbollah and they had lost Hamas, and they were getting the Houthis taking all the heat, that they had basically lost all of their surrogates. So now what is going to happen inside of Iran? Are they going to look at this and say, we have no choice, we have to have a nuclear weapon because we are so vulnerable? Or are they going to say, it's time to cut a deal with a guy who prides himself in making deals. So if you're going to the negotiating table, you have to have something that the other side wants. The other side, in our case, is going to want the total dismantlement of their nuclear program with on-site inspectors, not like before, but real on-site inspections. If that were to occur, there would be peace. And I think the Iranians know that. Their economy is in shambles. Inflation is running rampant. There's much, distrust of the leadership from the Iranian people. So I think they could either way. This could go either way. They're either going to go for it, in which case they picked the wrong guy to do this with, because Trump will follow through. He doesn't make threats. He just states what he's going to do. And they're not going to be able to have a nuclear weapon. So if I were to put money on it, I would put 75 cents on the fact that what they're trying to do is they're trying to get something on the table that they can give away that they don't really want, that would only bring them devastation and would remove the mullahs from power. And they're all about staying in power. The other 25 cents of that dollar would be they're lunatics. So who knows?
Well, let's move to Greenland. The idea of doing something about the security value of Greenland is still up in the air. Can you help us all understand why that part of the globe matters to our country?
It's the Arctic. If you look up at the North Pole and you look at the countries that have access to that, it's Russia, it's Canada, and Norway. We have to have some foothold up there, especially when you consider that ballistic missiles, were they to come from China or Russia, would come over the poles. So being up in Greenland allows you to put sensors up there, radar installations much further up to the north, as well as station troops there. In World War II, one of the critical areas, and it stays critical to this day because of Russia, is the Iceland-UK gap. That area of ocean between Iceland and the United Kingdom, where the Russian submarines and ships would come through. Well, if the climate is warming and if the ice recedes, it hasn't that much yet, but if it does, then Greenland will become all the more important than it is today.
Well, I'd like to ask the same thing about the Panama Canal. There's clearly an economic benefit to taking back some of the control of the canal versus China running more than its fair share. But is there also a security or military need to taking back the canal?
Absolutely, because China owns the two facilities on either end, both the Pacific and the Atlantic coast ends. With that, in a time of war, they could sabotage that and shut down that canal. And if you look at the size of the United States Navy, we tend to play away games. We don't play home games and haven't since the Revolutionary War, maybe the War of 1812. But the away game would be with China or with Russia or with Iran. For that to happen, we have our fleet spread all over the world, covering multiple oceans. We need that canal to get ships back and forth between the Atlantic and the Pacific as quickly as possible. All of our ships are designed to make it through that canal. That's part of maritime design. You make sure that you can get through that canal. So it's vitally important. We cannot have a potential adversary controlling passage through that vital network.
Well, one last short question. Greenland and the Panama Canal never came up in the campaign, and I don't recall any other president discussing their importance. So I'd like to ask, what else is there out there that we should concern ourselves with now?
Well, that's trying to get inside the head of the master negotiator, who happens to be sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And he's got enough balls in the air that his adversaries are focused in all those balls in the air. And in the meantime, he's getting his agenda accomplished. So who knows? Greenland came out of nowhere, and all it did was send his political adversaries into a tizzy. And that's right where he wants them.
Well, Captain Nash, we need your wisdom, and we are grateful for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.
One last quick question. Do you ever miss landing those jets on the aircraft carriers?
Not at night.
Thanks for your time today. In a moment, some thoughts of my own on these important issues of national security. When that war first began, for weeks I was on Zoom calls on a regular basis with leaders in the Christian community in Ukraine. It was tragic to hear the stories, the civilian populations being targeted, the apartment buildings that were being decimated by rocket fire. We bought vans, we sent food and clothing. We were doing whatever we could do to provide support and resources for the people that were trapped in that horrific conflict. Well, over the years, I saw political leaders posing like they were rock stars, American leaders flying to Ukraine to have their pictures taken with Zelensky. It looked more like they were posing for the cover of the Rolling Stone than they were concerned about the civilians and the people who were suffering so horribly. Well, I'm thankful for the grown-up voices that are now saying we have to bring a resolution to the conflict. Here in America, we aren't facing the same type of conflict that they face in Ukraine. You might not see a war zone within your community, but make no mistake about it, spiritual warfare is in every home, business, school, and church building, and they're just as real as the physical ones we see overseas. We see their carnage every day, the violence that leads to many news reports, the social engineering being forced upon children, the degradation of things that were meant to be entertainment. We must remember that as Christ followers, we're called to make a difference. God is sending us into the culture to bring about meaningful change. It was Jesus' words, John 20:21. He says, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. When you have opportunities to share the biblical values that you hold dear and talk about your hope in Jesus, remember this: He hasn't sent you onto the battlefield unarmed. You're coming in the powerful name of the Lord and you're filled with His Spirit. If we remember that, I promise there's more reasons for hope than despair. Well, that's my message for tonight, and after a short break, we'll start looking at your messages. We've got mail. Everyone on our team looks forward to your emails. Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Kathy from Lake Havasu City, Arizona said, Alan, I can't tell you how meaningful it is to have seen those two young Super Bowl quarterbacks openly express their joy in following Jesus. Thank you for bringing these comments to a population that may not watch the sports programming. God bless you. I couldn't agree more, Kathy. I thought they were remarkably courageous. They took their faith to work, and their office isn't a place where faith has been particularly welcome. If they can have the courage to do that on one of the largest stages in the world, surely we can take our faith with us beyond the confines of the churches where we gather to worship. We have to. And then Lee from Ohio said, you have helped me realize I need to step out of my comfort zone to be more assertive with my beliefs. Thank you. I agree, Lee. I think the real issue in that is understanding where we're comfortable. I want to become so comfortable with talking about my faith and the authority of Scripture and the place I've given to that in my life, that's as normal as talking about the sports teams that I prefer to support or my favorite foods or the restaurants I like to visit. When that becomes second nature, there's not an uncomfortable place at all. It's just normal to have those conversations about our faith. We've been coached inappropriately that our faith belongs in a worship service when there is spiritual music and then there's some reading of the Scripture. The truth is our faith is most important when we leave the church building, when we're conducting our lives in our normal routines. Let's create a whole new comfort zone and bring our faith back into the public square. If you miss our broadcast daily, you can always go to YouTube. We've created a channel. They post the program every day. It's easy to watch. If you like and subscribe, it helps us expand the audience and maybe even expand the program. Make sure you send your emails to comments@alanjacksonnow.com. From all of us here in Nashville, thank you for joining us tonight and have a wonderful evening.